Here's why the moral argument is dumb. First off, here's the argument.
If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists.
The moral argument for the existence of God tries to show that moral values must be objective and universal to make any sense. And if moral values are objective, the source must be a transcendent personal being who is concerned with the actions of human beings.
And it is a sound argument, but the premises are completely wrong. So let's go through them. But first, they feel it's important to disclaim that they're not saying that atheists cannot be moral, but that they just can't justify morality.
The question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God?
They can know good and evil without believing in God. But it's not about knowing good and evil, it's about grounding good and evil. It's about grounding it. What is your standard?
And yes, that's part of what they're saying. Without objective morality, there is no real set basis on what is right and what is wrong.
See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist.
By what standard are you judging God?
Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day.
But they go on to misconstrue that and say that if morality is subjective, then there is no right and wrong.
Another problem with cultural relativism is its premise that different answers to a given question means that there is no right answer.
But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one.
They may not personally think it's right, but they could not say it is wrong and be consistent.
If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong.
Which is simply not the case. If morality is subjective, then we still have morality. The difference is that not everybody has the same idea of morality. What you think is moral might not be what I think is moral. But they have a problem with that because apparently that just makes it a preference.
It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else.
In this view, individuals decide what is right and wrong for themselves and themselves only. Morality is nothing more than personal preference and opinion.
Because if it's a motive, I don't like that, you're saying that morals are like ice cream or pudding. I don't like tapioca. Never have.
The best you could say is, I choose not to do that because it's wrong for me, or I don't prefer that. When an ethical subjectivist makes a statement about the morality of an event or action, they're not talking about anything other than their opinion of it, and not about the thing itself.
But believe it or not, that's how it is. Lots of people think that homosexuality, flag burning, and cussing are immoral, but there's no rational reason for that. They think those things are immoral simply because they don't like them. But for the most part, morals are based on the harm that is done to other people, so it's not completely unfounded.
If you don't like something, that's when you can tolerate it, unless it's objectively evil. If it's an objective evil, like killing babies for fun, we don't tolerate it.
But that's exactly what you do. If you think that cussing is immoral, you're going to have to tolerate people that cuss. If you think homosexuality is immoral, you're going to have to tolerate the fact that people are homosexual. I think that eating meat is immoral, but I have to tolerate the fact that everybody that I know eats meat. But let's go through some points that also inadvertently prove subjective morality.
An ethical subjectivist could not meaningfully call the terrorist attack on September 11th evil or wrong. And they couldn't call the rescue workers good or heroic and make any sense.
Yes, they can. They just can't say that everybody agrees with them. Because, sure, I believe that the attacks were wrong, but not everybody agrees with that, as is evidenced by the fact that there was an organization behind the attacks. See, when making the moral argument, creationists will often give such appeals to emotion in an attempt to show that they are moral absolutes. But in doing so, they disprove objective morality because in order to give a real-world example, they have to talk about people who disagreed, which is to say, people who had a different sense of morality. Case in point.
And it's not merely what the society says. Think of this. Imagine if the Nazis had won World War II. And imagine then if every school children would learn of this history and hear that it's a good thing. If everybody on earth believed that that was a good thing, would it still make it a good thing? Absolutely not.
Absolutely not to you. But to everyone who was alive, it would be moral. So in that sense, yes, that would become what is moral. But think about it. There were Nazis. There were lots of people who thought that that was the moral thing to do. Lots of people whose senses of morality were subject to their ideas.
Just because Mexico, the United States, and China disagree on the issue of abortion does not mean there is no right or wrong approach to abortion. If two golfers disagreed on how many strokes one of them took on a hole, it doesn't mean there's no incorrect answer. Either both of them are wrong or one of them is right. They cannot both be right.
Just because golf has objective rules does not mean that life does. You first need to prove that there's a correct view of abortion.
When people disagree about morality, it does not mean there is no objective morality.
Yes, it does. If morality is objective, then we would all have the same view of morality. If we all had the same view of morality, we would never disagree about what is moral. We do disagree about what is moral, therefore morality is not objective. And it proves subjective morality, because the ability of people to have different senses of morality is the definition of subjective morality.
We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No.
You're right, it's an appeal to emotion. But let's go through these things. Child abuse. He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. Thou shalt beat him with the rod, and thou shalt deliver his soul from hell. Well, Sheol. All of this despite the fact that corporal punishment does not work, and oftentimes has the opposite effect, and also has adverse psychological effects. So when the Bible advocates these things, it's advocating not only physical child abuse, but emotional child abuse. Racial discrimination. For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. That's racist. Here's a fun Bible story about racism. And there was that time when a Canaanite woman begged Jesus to heal her daughter, but his reply was, "It is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to dogs." That's racist. Terrorism. Are you kidding? There's lots of terrorism in the Bible, especially in the book of Deuteronomy. Here's some excerpts that you can read. After you've read those, then tell me that Yahweh did not commit terrorism.
A very effective way to expose the bankruptcy of ethical subjectivism is by using examples of obvious moral clarity that apply to all people at all times. Torturing babies for fun is wrong is a well-known example.
Is killing babies for fun always wrong? I said, well, for all people at all times, is killing babies for fun wrong?
Psalm 137 verse 9. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones. So, evidently, there were people who thought that killing babies for fun was not wrong, as is evidenced by the fact that it is advocated in the holy book that you are trying to defend. So these guys go on to assert that absolute right and wrong do exist.
But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real.
Not really. It shows that you have moral values, but they are not objectively correct or incorrect.
Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals.
No, you only affirm that you have a sense of morality, not that everybody else has the exact same one.
There are several ways to show that all people, even self-professed relativists, actually believe in objective morality at their core.
Okay? I think everybody knows right and wrong. Everybody knows good and evil, whether you believe in God or not. Okay, the moral law is written on our hearts.
So now, apparently, it's obvious. It's universal. Everybody already has them. No. There are terrorists, there were Nazis, there are atrocities committed by people who do not have the same moral values written on their heart, as is evidenced by the fact that they did things that we consider terrible. See, in this, creationists are just projecting their own feelings onto other people, and they do this with a lot of things. They view things in a certain way, and they can't comprehend that other people don't.
One way we come to moral knowledge is directly. We know it through intuition. This immediate knowledge is important because some things are known only in themselves. No investigation of facts or reasoning is required. This is precisely what's demonstrated by clear case examples like torturing babies for fun is wrong. Nobody has to investigate this claim before they can take a moral stance on it. Our intuition enables us to recognize it as self-evident.
No, that's not the case. It's just that, psychologically, we make moral judgments before we rationalize those moral judgments. Most people, anyways. But here's a proof of subjective morality. If morality is subjective, it is subject to people's experiences and understandings. Because of this, the fact that morals develop actually prove a subjective morality. And these guys will often acknowledge that values change without realizing that they are going against their own point.
We change our values all the time. I mean, think about this. You and I, we change our morality all the time, right? I mean, you may believe something now that 10 years ago you would have held you wouldn't have held at all. I mean, do you think that you hold something now as wrong with maybe a little bit of age and experience that as a young person you'd say there's nothing wrong with that?
Just because we have moral intuition does not mean we don't have to develop it, however. Even though we have an intuition for logic, we still have to cultivate a reasonable mind to better act on that intuition. The same is true with moral intuition. We have to cultivate our minds to be sensitive to it and to act on it.
So our senses of morality are subject to the way that we're cultivated on it? I agree that, in a way, we're cultivated to morality. But isn't it weird that people who are cultivated in different societies and different groups hold different values? Doesn't that seem strange? Anyways, after they've proven that morality is objective, they will go on to say that God is what determines that objective morality.
God's character is the standard of his goodness, and his preferences are extensions of his character, not arbitrary decrees. Because God does not change, the standard does not change.
Really, God does not change. Then why did you once have a moral obligation to only eat animals that chew its cud and had split hooves, but then eventually you could eat any animal you want? And why was it once a moral obligation to mutilate genitals, but now it's okay if you don't do that? Now, if you're a Christian, you'll say that's because we have the Jesus clause. And that's true, but keep in mind the fact that God changed his mind between the Old Testament and the New Testament does not help your case that there is one single objective morality.
Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination.
Greed. Read these. Any of these. Ancient Israelites were incredibly greedy, often as a result of commandments from God. Abuse. I already talked about child abuse, but it's also okay to beat your slave, as long as he doesn't die, of course. Discrimination. I already talked about that. But they'll go on to say that only the Christian God can give objective morality.
And human persons, by the way, have intrinsic moral value. This is a Christian idea that all men are created equal. It comes from the fact that we all bear the imago Dei, the image of God. That is the thing that makes us equal.
This approach asks what the necessary preconditions are for objective morality and argues that only the God of the Bible can account for it.
All of you have equal standing and equal worth because you are inherently God's image bearers. And only Christianity can offer that answer.
This is despite the fact that Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the Baha'i faith all have this exact same concept. And every other religion has an explanation for morality. For example, Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism have the concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence, which is justified by the idea that all beings shared the same divine spark, and because of that, to harm another being is essentially the same as harming yourself. And to me, that's a far better explanation of morality than what you're giving me, because I think that a morality based on the concept of everyone being equal is better than a morality based on what we are given by a sexist, homophobic, genocidal, infanticidal, warmongering, jealous, tyrannical God. So the moral argument falls apart because defending its premises relies solely on argument from consequences and appeal to emotion.